United States. So even though this is a cold day, I'd like you to give a warm applause in welcoming Professor Lee Wilkins to the podium.
Okay, so after that introduction, I'm going to do almost none of that. There's a little ethics that's going to work its way in towards the end. I don't normally write very much about culture or popular culture, so I have to sort of tell you how this project came about. The paper that I'm going to be talking you through is written with a dear friend of mine, Janet Saidi, who was, when we started to write this, a faculty member at the University of Missouri, but now is, when I get this title right, Vice President of the KCPT, which is the public television station in Kansas City, Missouri. So in some sense, this is a collaboration. Janet and I used to teach together. This is a collaboration between two people who at their core consider themselves working journalists. And if it comes out of anywhere, it comes out of sort of that worldview. We got started on this because in about the same calendar year, Janet's very precocious 9-year-old daughter gave her a copy of the first book of the Hunger Games. And my not so precocious 24-year-old daughter gave her father, the 4th grade teacher, a copy of the first book of the Hunger Games. So through our daughters, we both got introduced to the books and then later on the films. And as everybody here knows, but I don't believe in PowerPoints, and besides, you guys have all seen the movies, so just engage your imaginations, we'll be fine. When Janet and I first read the books, our response was that the books themselves are more about the media than anybody had given them credit for. And that is a sort of a thesis statement that I will come back to and come back to and come back to today. There's been a lot of stuff written about the Hunger Games, there's a whole feminist critique of Katniss and, and so forth and so on. But to the best of my knowledge, as I stand here now, no one has looked at first the books and then the films as something that has to do with media. And that's sort of going to be my focus. And when I say media, Janet and I use this in the sense of the media is really a character in the books. If you look at other dystopias, my favorite one to look at is Clockwork Orange because it's so gritty. The media is a tool. But in the Hunger Games, the media is a character that actually spurs action and responses in other characters. And in that sense, it's very, very different than a lot of the dystopias that the author, Suzanne Collins, said that she read, that sort of gave her the inspiration for the books. So with all that as preface, for the folks here in communication, I'm going to start with something that you all know, so you may have to do. It says this: culture is ordinary. This statement by William Raymond Williams, I think, does a fabulous job of encapsulating something that I think is crucial about popular culture. A, that it's ordinary, but B, that it can be really smart. And I am going to suggest that Suzanne Collins' work here is really, really smart about a couple of things. So Janet and I looked at the Hunger Games through the lens of popular culture. Why did we do this, or what's the justification for that? Well, as you all know, they're hugely popular. The book spent more than 100 weeks on the New York Times bestseller lists. I have no idea what the 4 movies have grossed, but it's certainly in the billions, and it's also certainly worldwide. The films themselves and the books have also produced all kinds of interesting spin-offs. I haven't gone through and counted, but I don't recall in popular work a lot of bow and arrow work outside of the classic Western until Katniss picked up a bow and arrow in the Hunger Games. In fact, bows and arrows have become so popular that the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts are actually having to add additional classes in archery. So the notion that these books have had a significant cultural impact in many, many ways, I think sort of justifies taking a look at them and a look at them in some depth. The other thing that Janet and I did when we were sitting down to write about these is, of course, you read everything that the author herself has ever said about the books, because you're trying to get some sense of, do I think about this the way she does or whatever. So I'm going to give you a little bit of what Collins herself has said about writing the book. Janet and I both believe, and Collins herself has sort of intimated this, that these books emerged from her own very personal experiences as a child growing up. Now, what she has said is that the inspiration for them came when she was in some of those, sort of waking, dreaming states, when you've got one eye open at the TV, but you're not really sure whether you're awake or asleep. And in 2003 and 2004, the television she was watching was our invasion of Iraq and then the war in Afghanistan. And as she was channel surfing and flipping between the news and reality television, okay, as we understand the term today, she got this idea for these two things that in some ways would sort of collide. Janet and I actually think that her inspiration was a little deeper than that. When she was a child, her dad was in the Vietnam War. And so she got news of him via television. The battles, the deaths, all the rest of that sort of stuff. And so this very, very personal thing, how is my parent doing? Is my father surviving this? Janet and I believe began to permeate her thinking as well as become an inspiration for how she sat down to write these books. In the process, she invented characters that are so media savvy that they actually are able to use the media for their own ends. And this includes not just the characters of the Revolution, Katniss, Peeta, and Gale, but also the characters who are in power and who develop what I think is in many ways a highly mediated state. So one of the first theme that Janet and I spent a lot of time talking about is, if I can find how we said it, that the omnipresent state through the mass media is really the first theme of this trilogy. And there are cool ways that happens, so let me talk about that a little bit. As you all know, okay, so now I have to ask, has anybody here neither seen the films, at least one of them, or read the book? Is there anyone who's a complete, oh dear, okay, so you need to stop me when I zing past plot points that you go, that doesn't make any sense. For this group of informed people, okay, I'm gonna talk through some things pretty quickly. As you all know, but you will now learn, the books themselves are told primarily through interior monologue. And the interior monologue is primarily Katniss's interior monologue. She is the person through whose eyes we see the action. Now, interior monologue is really difficult to capture on film. And when you capture it, it gets pretty darn boring pretty darn fast. So one of the things that the filmmakers had to do when they went to make these films was to find ways to illustrate the interior monologue that the readers of the books have, only to do it in cinema. And luckily, I think there was a pretty good filmmakers here. So the first instance of that happens early in the first book. We hear Katniss talk about what it's like to grow up in her district, what it's like to be subject to this sort of harvesting, every year. In the relationship that she has with Gale, how she hunts, her very, very difficult relationship with her immediate nuclear family because she lost her father in a mining accident. What the filmmakers do is they boil it all down, okay, to an interview with Caesar Flickerman. All right, now Caesar Flickerman is a talk show host, played a little bit over the top, as is very appropriate, by Stanley Tucci in all of the films. Caesar's job is to make the Hunger Games more like reality TV and to certainly make them more entertaining. But what the filmmakers do at the opening of the very first film is they have Caesar Flickerman interviewing the designer of the Hunger Games. And the question is, what would you say your signature is? Okay? the very next thing the film goer hears is a piercing, terrified scream. And that is one of the techniques. And so that's his signature, okay? If you're in the Hunger Games that he has designed, before he kills you, he is going to scare you to death. And he's kind of proud of that. But that's the way that the filmmakers have chosen to sort of externalize, if you will, the interior monologue that Katniss has when she reads the books, when you read the books and you are privy to her thoughts. And there's all sorts of things that go through that. Secondly, one of the things that, and so I'm going to read you a little part of the interior monologue that sort of demonstrates how media savvy Katniss really is. Now, she and all of the children who live in Panem, for those of you who have Latin, I have not, so I had to look this one up. In the dictionary, it means bread, who have been raised in Panem, are forced to watch the Hunger Games. You cannot opt out. And so, if for those of us who sort of subscribe to social learning theory, and I kind of do, these kids have had a lot of time to learn about how you play the Hunger Games, what sort of the tricks of the trade are. They have their heroes, they have their favorites, all of that sort of stuff. But they also know and incorporate into their very being that being successful in the Hunger Games is not just being a successful slaughterer of your colleagues, which of course is the point of the games itself, but learning how to do that in a televised way that gives you a chance to survive. So here's Katniss in the middle of the Hunger Games. Move, I whisper to myself. I wiggle out of my sleeping bag. I've been concealed by darkness and the sleeping bag and the willow branches, and it has probably been difficult for the cameras to get a good shot of me. I know they must be tracking me now, though. The minute I hit the ground, I'm guaranteed a close-up. The audience will have been beside themselves, knowing that I was in the tree, that I overheard the careers talking, that I discovered Peeta was with them. Until I work out exactly how I want to play that, I'd better at least act on top of things. Not perplexed, certainly not confused or frightened. No, I need to look one step ahead of the game. So, as I slide out of the foliage and into the dawn light, I pause a second, giving the cameras time to lock on me. Then I cock my head slightly to the side and give a knowing smile. There, let them figure out what that means. So this is Katniss using the media, and she does this, as do all the other combatants in the Hunger Games, throughout all of the books and in somewhat different ways through all of the films. So what Janet and I concluded is that this is a very different way of thinking about media. It's not just the media is a tool, it's that media is a tool that lots and lots of different people are using, and with some knowledge of what they think the media actually is going to produce or provoke. The second big point about this is that Janet and I thought it was really interesting, and this cuts a little bit close to the bone right now because we're in a presidential election year, that in the books and in the films, the media themselves are seldom, if ever, the target of actual criticism. Okay? It is all about the mediated spectacle. And in fact, if there's something that characterizes how the public responds to media in the Hunger Games, I think it would be most likely called apathy. Collins creates a world where literally you cannot opt out. You can't opt out from watching, you can't opt out from participating, and you can't opt out from somehow letting what's going on in the media seep into your conscience. What you failed to do in her world is to say, hey, the media here is part of the problem. That is in and of itself a really, really interesting statement about how at least the citizens of Panem think about the role of the media when it comes to the Hunger Games. It's there to provide the spectacle. It's not there to be a critic. So I will just say the words Donald Trump and let it hang in the air. But it is to say that I think that this comment, although she makes it in the context of the Hunger Games, says a whole lot about how many of us, most of the time, respond to mediated politics. And it presents, I think, a democracy. Pan Am is not a democracy, but it presents democracies with a really interesting set of questions about how is it that we, meaning the public, take control back from the mediated spectacle. Okay? For those of you who haven't read the book, let me go back. As those of you who have read the book or have seen the last two films realize, okay, the real revolution in Pan Am is not televised. Okay? That's District 13. They've burrowed underground. They've sort of been literally living sub rosa for the 75 years of the Hunger Games and then planning their revolution. It's an interesting commentary that Janet and I come back to about the difference between front stage and backstage behaviors. In 1986, a guy by the name of Joshua Meyerowitz, who was working off of some stuff from Goffman and others, wrote what I thought was a really compelling book about when you're front stage, that's when you're willing for the public to see you. So I'm front stage. I know that I'm talking to the public. I know that I'm talking to this camera. When I'm home singing in the shower, I'm backstage. And I really wouldn't want you guys to see me, okay? No offense, but one of the things that Meyerowitz says is that television confounds front stage and backstage behavior. That the things that we used to think about as backstage behavior, I'm picking my mate, become the subject for, oh, I don't know, The Bachelor, okay? Reality television. So I'll just say the word Donald Trump again and let it hang there, okay? Postman had a word for this. He called it amusing yourself to death, okay? And this is the notion that, and he meant it to go clear back to Rome, is that, you know, the way that you pacify a populace is to give them bread and circuses. Pan Am called bread, circuses, the Hunger Games. And when people are so busy worrying about where's my next bite of food going to come from, and they're lulled by the relief that they are not the participants in Hunger Games, you're not going to get a revolution. Okay. I think Collins makes this point really, really emphatically in the third book, when the rebels, led by Katniss and Gale, are literally recreating the mining accident that cost Katniss's father her life. And Collins portrays this as an ethically charged time for Katniss, a place where she has to begin to do some moral reasoning about, you know, what's the appropriate thing to do. But I want to read you just a little bit of the discussion that she and Gale have about this, because I think it brings home Collins's point. So she says, Gale reports to Katniss, quote, "The whole country just sat back and watched," end quote, as the District 2 mountain workers and the Capitol soldiers dissolved into an inner battle. Quote, "Well, that's what they do best," end quote, replies Katniss. It is the same choice to watch or to act that confronts Katniss to the very, very end of the book. And she's not the only person that does. Okay. And the sort of the place that I want to leave this is, it's not just, how do I want to say this? It's not just about the politics you internalize. It's about the politics that you're willing to do something about after you've internalized it. And if we were writing a different kind of paper, that's another sort of meta theme of all three books, is how does Katniss become whole, where her internal matches her external in some important ways. Okay, the second theme that I want to scoot over real clearly, but to make a point is also Collins is, I think, very wise, or at least savvy, about the business end of the media entertainment business. And I was struck by that this morning by two different things. The first is the email that we all got about our public television station here ganging up with the Michigan State Public TV station to broadcast more programming for children of a certain sort. And I'm going, really? Anybody think this isn't a business decision? The second, of course, is, I think it's today, ABC Family changes its focus from ABC Family to, as I heard it explained on NPR this morning, the audience segment that is between the first kiss and the first kid. Again, a really interesting business decision, right? My point here is that Collins is really wise about the economics of the media, and she uses it in this way in Pan Am. So, for example, one of the themes of the books is that when media messages are reduced to entertainment, the future is subordinate to the interests of the medium on which it's produced. So, for example, in the Flickerman interviews, he'll ask this just ostensibly entertaining, but deeply philosophical, personal, private question. And then when the person answers to say, okay, that's good, now let's essentially go to commercial. And that way of segmenting the Hunger Games permeates the entire series of books. So you have this kind of horror that's carved up into very nice commercial segments with a very appealing guy at the front to make sure that you understand it, okay, and can talk about things in a positive manner. For those of you who've seen the first film, when the representatives of the district come into the arena for the first time, and of course there's the play-by-play announcers, right? We all know what those are, okay? These are not the old guys from the Muppets, which is what I wish they were. This is more like football play-by-play or soccer play-by-play. And they talk about what the contestants look like, and then they do these really cool flashbacks, okay, again, being football. I also saw concussion over the break, so you can tell, of previous Hunger Games. And so one of the ones that comes up is when you have a previous contestant who we meet again at the quarter quell, who has a bloody brick in his hand, who's literally bludgeoning his remaining single opponent to death with that brick. And the commentators are talking about, I so love this moment. This is when a contestant becomes a victor. And you're sort of going, yeah, that's one way to look at it. But of course, the way that Collins has talked about it is, this is when the medium used for commercial purposes, sort of digs itself into, well, a very deep moral or ethical pit. Last but not least, I want to talk a little bit about sort of the part of the paper that is a little bit more me than Janet, not too much, about what the Hunger Games says about privacy and the role of privacy in politics and in becoming a political person. It's not any surprise to everybody, and I know that Elizabeth in her own research is using this concept. But one of the things that the filmmakers had to do, because they couldn't again have Katniss's interior monologue available to them, was to kind of invent an arena that we all could see, not just through Katniss's eyes, but visually. So what they invented was Jeremy Bentham's panopticon. Bentham invented the panopticon as a way, I kid you not, to reform criminals. His notion was that you would put people in an environment where they would be watched constantly, 24/7, and that because of the continual watching, their behavior would improve, okay? So scrap, it's Jeremy Bentham, right? He wrote 250 years ago, so he didn't have available all of the information to us that we do about really watching improves driving in Detroit on the freeway. I hadn't noticed. But it is this notion that if the state takes away your privacy, or invades it to certain extent, that you will behave differently. And so if there's a second theme to the Hunger Games, it really is all focused on that issue. For about the last 3 millennia, privacy has been defined as 2 things. 1, control over information about you. 2, control over the context in which that information is understood. And that is, of course, what the Hunger Games strip away from Katniss. And I think it is one reason that Collins wrote the books as interior monologues, because that's the only place that Katniss can continue to be private, is in her own head. Because everything else she does is televised, you know, from falling in love to, you know, killing people to the whole bit. And so what Janet and I did when we were looking at this is we said, this does a couple of really compelling things as far as we can figure out. Communitarian philosophy says that in order to be private and in order for communities to make privacy work, communities have to take control of their own narrative. So it's not just enough to be private in a person, you have to be private within a community. And in fact, if you're a communitarian philosopher, community comes first and individuality comes second. And I have to admit, I'm a little bit more on that side of the fence most days. Narratives are something that a culture builds. Control the narrative, you control a lot of things. I will say, Detroit bankruptcy. Flint, lead in the water, okay? Who controls that narrative controls an awful lot of political response, as well as our individual thinkings to it. So, as Janet and I were looking at this, we were saying, well, one of the things that's happening here is the culture is no longer able to control the narrative. You have the people in power who can control the narrative, but those are all of the folks who get the control. And the media cooperates with that, collaborates in a corrosive sense. But the other thing about this is that Katniss and Gale and Peeta, bless his heart especially, use the media in this way. They sort of divulge things that are private, in the part of it that I read to you, in order to get something else that they want. And in philosophy, we all say that privacy is a negotiated thing, but the place where it gets dangerous for us here, but also in the films and in the books, is what philosophers call an encroachment on moral autonomy, or the notion that we no longer have the capacity to shape our own moral biographies. And in fact, when Peeta talks about dying in the Hunger Games, one of the things he says in, I think, 2 of the 3 books is, I want to die as myself. Okay, I want control over how I die. Peeta is unwilling to give up his own moral biography to the Hunger Games. Katniss feels that she doesn't really have much of a choice. Okay, so I can shut up and you guys can talk. So as Janet and I were thinking about this, and keep in mind this is about 5 years ago, we sort of looked at it and said, where else is this happening? And our response was, this is social media. This is where, and keep in mind, Janet had a tweener, okay? He was just moving into social media. And our daughter kind of skipped social media, plus as you all know, her mom's a troglodyte. But she's had to learn to use it in her job. And so one of the things that Janet and I started to think about is, you know, when you're on Facebook, you're essentially creating an alternate you. What does this have to say about your autonomy, your privacy, your ability to control your own moral biography? Because as we all know, Facebook isn't for us. Facebook is for friends or people who may stumble into it, or God forbid, journalists who go on Facebook to try to get information about you should you die. So this left this paper and Janet and me with this question, and we don't have an answer to it, but I do still think it's really worth asking. And about the time we finished the first draft of this paper, there began to be some research coming out of Europe, of all places, that talked about the impact that Facebook was having on teenagers. And one of the things that that research says is that teenagers say, I've spent so much time and energy maintaining this persona on Facebook. That's not me. But I feel like I have to do it because I'm a teenager and that's what teenagers do, and it's social media and all of that other sort of stuff. But this Facebook entity that I've created, it's not just that it's not me, it is a huge time sink, it's a huge energy sink, and it's worrisome. Because now I'm really trying to figure out, how do I get autonomy back? So this is the question that this left Janet and me with. Most of the literature, well not most, all of the literature that I have read on privacy, okay, and on decision making about privacy, assumes an adult perspective. We're adults. We know what's private. I have read zero literature, and despite the fact that I am the queen of null searches in the library, I've also asked a bunch of my friends who are psychologists and social psychologists if they've seen anything about this. I've read zero literature about how it is that we come to this adult notion of privacy. It's clear that we're not born with it. You know, my 3-month-old grandson has no notion of privacy. My God, you should see all the people who watch him get his diaper changed, okay? Somehow, between that, and I hope when he is an adult, he will evolve or develop or acquire a sense of privacy. But we, meaning scholars in the academy, don't really know how that happens. I mean, we don't know. We're actually pretty clueless. I can find zero studies that try to look systematically at what are the issues in moral development that might promote the development of an adult sense, a robust sense of privacy and autonomy. They're not there, you know. We've got all the anecdotes about people who sort of fell off the privacy platform, but not a very good sense about how we managed to get on that platform and stay on that platform as we grow and develop and mature. So Janet and I think that one of the great things about these books is, at least for us, it prompted us to ask this question because it is Katniss's struggle, especially in the third book. And for those of you who have read the book, remember in the very last part, she and Peeta go back to District 12, which is pretty deserted and pretty bombed out. And she still gets to deal with her, what we would today call PTSD. But so she's still, at that point in her life, negotiating privacy, autonomy, and belonging, okay, all at the same time. And Janet and I think that this is a theme also that goes through all of these books. You know, what are the connections? How do we understand them? So, because I was polluted by NPR this morning, as I was getting ready to do this, I thought, NPR, for those of you who are not junkies like I am, did a story this morning. Somebody's done a poll on the angry American. Why are we so pissed? And it turns out that Caucasian women are even more pissed than Caucasian men. And Caucasians are way more PO'd than African Americans, and on and on and on and on and on. But what I was thinking about as I was sort of listening to that and thinking about this is we really don't have, as scholars and as researchers, a very good handle on how people become autonomous yet members of a political community. We don't know very much about how that negotiation happens. We don't understand how people do it very well as individuals, and we certainly don't understand how people do it as part of a larger community, okay? Pick your community. And getting back to culture's ordinary, okay, I think that is one of the really profound questions that this book and these films, which are arguably aimed at teenagers and not us grown-ups, really leaves us with. How is it that people make these connections and sustain these connections over lives that, in Katniss's case, were somewhat difficult? So that's my version of the Hunger Games. Comments, questions, things you hated? Let me have it. Elizabeth.
So when you're talking about how privacy as from an adult perspective, would you argue that all of the representations that Katniss and all of the other actors in the Hunger Games put out are at the adult stage of understanding the mediated experience and are as savvy?
I think their use of media is savvy, but no, I would argue almost the reverse. What I see happening, and you all who've read this and seen this may really disagree, is sometimes we learn things about ethical decision making by making mistakes. And I think that is more than anything else what happens with Katniss. So for example, for the cameras, she has to fall in love with Peeta, right? That's the story.
Mm-hmm.
But it's only on the train going back to District 12 that she realizes, and it's done differently in the films than it is in the books, but it hits it both places, that, oh my God, I've been in love with him on TV. I have to marry the guy, even though the person I really think that I'm in love with right now is Gale. That is, I mean, regardless of what you think about their penultimate relationship, that's a mistake, and I think that is how she learns. And I suspect, but I can't prove, that for many of us, that is how we learn, especially about things like privacy, because there, at least to my knowledge, there's no hard and fast set of rules. Jade?
I recently was doing interviews with teenage girls in DPS, dealing with how they do use technology and what they think about internets and computers. And one of the interviews I did was really, it stuck with me, and I was like, I don't know what this means. And your question, she said to me, what I learned is that you can't share yourself with the world. Like, and she meant this more in like, she can't take pictures of herself and post them online. And I was like, where did you learn that that was a private thing, or that was something to be like ashamed of? And this comes back to the idea that I think to a certain extent we might learn privacy due to what is and isn't shameful, right? It is shameful to share this part of yourself with people. It is shameful to say, I have this stigma, or I have done this thing, and that we learn it through shame procedures, I wonder.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Was she saying it in a way that she felt ashamed of what she'd done?
No, more along the lines of, I learned that you shouldn't do that, like you shouldn't share your ideas, your thoughts, your body, pictures of yourself out loud and with people, because that can just get anywhere so quickly nowadays.
Well, I think that's one of the things that technology's given us about privacy is remember, you guys, I'm incredibly old, so when I grew up, you talked to your 10 friends. There was no Facebook. Now you really do talk to the world.
Yeah.
And so I think we're learning it differently, and I think in some ways more quickly and with a much harder edge. And the thing about Facebook is that you control the information, but you don't control the context in which it's understood, and that's the second half of any philosophical definition of privacy for the last 3,000 years. Okay, the Greeks are no different than contemporary philosophers when it comes to that. So I think what she's saying is she's sort of realizing context matters. Mm-hmm. It matters more to me than I ever thought it would, and I think that's a learning thing. I wouldn't say that the comment, as you're relaying it to me, is about shame. It's about she's kind of had an epiphany, like, oh boy,
this can get places. Everything that I type can get places really quick.
Right. It's when our students are freshmen and they have their Facebook pages and they put all the photos on the Facebook page of, the So I'll use the Missouri example, the drunken and mostly naked fraternity toga party, okay? And then they become juniors and they start applying for internships. And they realize that the skills that we have been teaching them, how to look for somebody online, are being taken by their potential employers and used as a way to sort of say, well, do I really want this, person who at the age of 16, 17, or 18, got drunk, or a toga, did whatever. Some of our students say, well, everybody's done that, so it isn't going to be held against me. I'm not so sure. But I do know that we teach them how to do that. Yes?
Well, I have several responses. My first one is, when you were talking about the lack of privacy, we're talking about the novel with the Hunger Games. I immediately thought of 1984, where the government is watching you, but you're not, it's not being broadcast to the world, it's being led to an unknown source.
Right.
That you don't have control over. But the other thing is that you're talking about this texting is, people go around texting the girls who say, text themselves naked to their friends and find it all over the web. So where's the boundary between, like you said, privacy and what? And then there is the other question that is, to my mind, the idea of that the media now is like, I got off of Facebook largely because it was taking so much time. It was just taking up, it was a big time waste. It was like,
Yeah.
so I can understand these. So those are my three reactions, and I'm curious what you said.
Collins has said in multiple interviews that 1984 was a book that she really liked to read as a teenager. So the fact that you've made that connection, spot on, okay? The author herself says it. As to Facebook being a time sink, I don't know, because I made a decision a long time ago not to Facebook for lots of reasons, one of them which has a great deal to do with privacy, both my privacy and the privacy of my family. But the research coming out of Europe has said that teenagers between certain ages really do spend an awful lot of time, not just on Facebook, but sort of conceptualizing how they want their Facebook to look. So you don't have just the time of, the keyboarding and the uploading of photos and this, that, and the other thing. But you've sort of got, this is a really old-fashioned term, you've got the pre-writing part of it that's actually going on before they sit down to do the work. So I tend to agree with you. I honestly don't know, okay, I can say this. I don't know if I did Facebook where I would fit it in my day. I don't know where I would find the time for it. And your comment about we text all this stuff. Every time I'm at the airport and I don't have TSA pre-check, there's a part of me that says we should just all show up at the airport butt naked. And after a while, everybody get over it, but then we could go through. The airport, to me, I every time I go through that process, I think I'm giving up some of my privacy. And I guess I'm willing to do that to be safe on an airplane, but it still makes me sort of cringe. And the example that I use with students is, how many of you have peed in a cup to get a job? With this generation of kids, they all raise their hands, every single one of them. Somebody asked me to do that, I would be out the door in a heartbeat. It is not worth it to me. So one of the reasons that I like privacy as a topic, but I especially like it in the Hunger Games, is because I think you see it evolving in the films and in the books. I think you see some really smart questions being asked about it. And even Michael?
Well, let's see. I'm
Uh-oh.
gonna try to make the three streams of things that you made me think about relate to each other.
All right.
I'm not sure how to do that. The first thing is just a general observation about the portrayal of the way that the games were broadcast to everybody. I grew up in the 1970s, and one of the things that we most anticipated in every 4 years was the Olympic Games. So ABC's Wide World of Sports, and then when NBC took that over, there were so many of those flashbacks to previous champions. I mean, I remember the 1980 Lake Placid Olympics, and what there were a couple of brothers from Norway, and I forget their names now, but the name that I do remember is Ingemar Stenmark, the Norwegian downhill super slalom skier or ski jumper. I forget which one he was now. I just remember Stenmark because they kept showing, oh, great champions of the past, and here's how he became a champion. That sort of thing. So that's the first thing.
Wow, I never even made that connection. That's great.
Well, along with that, you have a combination of coverage of Olympic Games, and there are all these different events sprawled over an enormous territory that they have to keep track of, but there's always dead time. The other event where there's dead time and they have to fill that up with hero portraits is any weekend of a major golf competition, the Masters, for instance. They're always having these flashbacks to Jack Nicklaus, for instance, and Ben Hogan, and so on and so forth. One day Tiger Woods will be the one that they're doing these things about, if they're not doing it already. I guess I'll organize this biographically then. So yeah, early childhood. All right, we get into the 1990s when social media didn't really exist yet. Its genes were beginning to emerge from the primordial ooze that was my generation trying to figure out what to do with ones and zeros, and trying to figure out how to make money off of it. So there were all these really underdeveloped ways that people at a distance could relate to each other in the form of the well, for instance, or what else? Any of the chat rooms that were made available via early versions of either CompuWare or CompuServe or AOL. And in those chat rooms, people would deliberately cultivate alter egos as people to have fun with, to try on different ideas that they thought were a little racy, maybe a little dangerous. And they would cultivate these alter egos. All right, moving into the present now. I was alarmed on Facebook because, I have an alter ego I sometimes try out on Facebook called The Angry American. And he types in all
I thought of
caps,
you
and
this
he
morning.
deliberately misspells things and so on and so forth. And I was taken aback last night to see that after I had posted a little something about a conversation I had with my barber about, what if I were to get back into skeet shooting, what kind of a gun would I want to go with? And he said Benelli was really good. Well, within 24 hours of that, I started seeing recruitment ads for the Republican National Leadership Initiative show up in my feed. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, they're not trying to recruit me, they're trying to recruit the angry American. So, all right, the big thing, the academic thing that this connects to now is Pierre Bourdieu. His notion of all of culture, all the way that we improvise through life is a game, and it's a process of mastering the rules of the game. The more we master the rules, the better we get at it. The better we get at the game, the more power we amass. The more power we amass, we develop an ability to change the rules of the game ourselves if we become influential enough. So you take Bourdieu and apply that to Katniss's journey through the 3 books, and what we're seeing is this process of her mastering these, having first mastered the ability to survive, then noticing I kind of suck at managing my image in the media, and mastering her ability to manage that. And then, ultimately, she amasses enough power, she's able to change the rules of the game. And I'll shut up now, because I've been rambling for about 5 minutes.
No, I was gonna say, the thing the thing where this left me is in the very last pages of the third novel, where it's not a game, she can't make it a game.
Yeah.
And I got caught on the third or fourth draft. Jan and I have worked on this paper a long time. The third or fourth draft where I found this thing about your moral narrative. And I thought, you know what, that maybe for these books makes sense, because she struggles from the very first moment with the notion that she's got to kill somebody. And as much as she struggles, Peeta struggles even more, and Gale is much more comfortable with it because that's how he's going to make the revolution. And I think that's why in the third book, when she shoots Coin, this is the new leader, okay? When she shoots Coin, because she's finally figured out who the enemy is. Thank you, Pogo. The enemy is us. Why it's such a crucial moment for her, because I think that's the place where it all comes together. But I hadn't thought about this, thinking of boredom. So now I'm going to have you guys. Okay, draft number 5.
Is this done?
Is this done? No, because Michael's just messed me up again.
Hey, sorry, man.
It's done to the point where it got accepted for a conference, and then Janet and I have been talking about where to submit it. The problem that we're having is Janet's master's degree is from the UK, and so it's not social sciencey enough for Americans. It's got too much philosophy in it for it to be a pure cultural studies paper. So we've unfortunately grown this thing that I guess is one part elephant and one part camel, and we don't really know too much to do with it. You got ideas, Elizabeth?
Sorry.
Yeah, journalism. So I will just keep presenting it, as long as Walter will allow. But also just because we both had a really good time writing this. Yes, sir. I'm sorry.
I'm gonna make a couple points here, and I haven't seen the books or read the movies, but I'm thinking maybe these things you're talking about aren't as novel to me as I once thought they were. Years ago, before like the Hunger Games was like ever even a thing, I remember one point you brought up the how people are kept in a trap of their own mind, basically, with these televised events that they have here.
I didn't really say that, but go.
Well, what did you say? It was something close to it.
It was something about how the reality that's here is mediated. But the way that this is used is very deliberate. So I wouldn't construe it as a trap, but you might. That's okay. Finish your thought.
I was just saying this actually reminds me of a certain cartoon that was on like mid-2000s. It was actually a DC Comics commercial, and it basically actually depicted a tiered society of like rulers and the struggling underclass, and they make a point 3 times that the whole point of their Coliseum games that they have is to basically distract the people from their problems. They imply it 3 times. First from a civilian who talks about their problems, but then sort of like shrugs them off because they suddenly start talking about the next slaughter. Then you say the ruler who says it explicitly, and then you actually, DC Comics, so it's actually Superman who becomes a gladiator and actually says it to the ruler's face. So, yeah, that sort of reminded me how like, it almost feels like this was like sort of a mini thing of that before it was even a thing.
Well, and I agree with you because I don't think this is an uncommon theme. I mean, unfortunately, it does go back to Rome, Orwell uses it. I think it's buried in Clockwork Orange. I think in a very different way, it's a part of All the King's Men. So I mean, I think through literary history, we have lots of forebears of this. I just wrote about this one, but I don't disagree with what you're making at all. I think it's right on. Yes.
I'm just thinking about, as you're talking about mediated communication and this, and I'm thinking about wherever I go now, I see people on their phones and you see the kids like this constant. I'm on the bus, I take the bus, I got on the bus when I saw everybody like this. Nobody was talking to each other. Then I went to a restaurant and I saw a family having dinner. And everybody was on the phone. They weren't talking to each other. They were all like this. And I thought, is that a dinner? Are these people actually having conversation? What exists as a family? They were all connected to this. And so there was a part of me that's thinking, they weren't in the present, they were somewhere else, even though they were all in the same room.
Right. And
Absent presence.
yeah, the interesting thing is I think how we're gonna handle it. So since I bragged about being a new grandparent, I've been paying attention to the American Academy of Pediatrics, which recommends no screen time on any device before the age of 2. And I'm really watching how my daughter and her husband are going to do this, or if they're going to be able to do this, because I know a whole bunch of kids, and I'm not saying this as being critical at all. This is just purely observational. I know a whole bunch of kids that the first toy they really want is mommy or daddy's phone, because mommy and daddy spend a whole heck of a lot of time on the darn thing.
Yeah.
So I am just really curious as somebody who's probably not going to be researching and writing about this, but if I had 20 years and a longitudinal cohort, it would be one of the things that I would be investigating, because I think it's just fascinating in all senses of that word. Elizabeth, you want to do this study?
It's been like kind of too far outside my area to do it, but I think about this issue of privacy being an adult decision, and I feel like this generation that we're currently seeing, and the Katniss Everdeen generation, is very, you're right, kind of doing this by trial and error, their privacy decisions, because we haven't had these new technologies to deal with before. But I think what we're seeing for young children, people who are millennials who are having children, they're in control of their child's privacy disclosures from birth onward.
Yeah.
And to me, that's fascinating, is that somebody's going to enter adulthood and not have had any decision-making whatsoever on their
I had not
privacy.
even thought about it that way. You should do this study.
and
What about
And I
younger fellow
think-
who posted a photo of his kid on the toilet?
well, and it's very interesting, because in the Hunger Games series, I mean, these kids just go out there without any sort of parental guidance. It doesn't really seem like there's any sort of, but I think that era is kind of ending, where we're seeing no more parental guidance or no more, because I think we're seeing more of a helicopter in real life. Where it's,
Well, but my daughter certainly would agree with the helicopter part. I mean, I think the interesting thing will be when this, so I'll use my grandson as an example. When my grandson becomes a teenager, now we all know what teenagers do, they rebel, okay? So I'll be real curious to see what form his rebellion, if it A, is focused on this issue at all, I have no idea. But if it is, what form it takes. Because certainly one way to rebel is to just get off the grid, and there are people who are doing that as an experiment. I think one of our candidates that we interviewed last semester, it was Rosie. She'd been off the grid for 5 months. The research says 6 months and you have a new habit. So I just don't know. For me, this is just a fascinating question, and I should up. Walter, thank you very much.